Okay, so let me show you take-up, and let's see some results. So here's the take-up. We did this as a field experiment or randomized controlled trial. So, you know, the 4 types of loans were offered to random groups of farmers that came into us, and from a random group of about 3,000. And then, like I said, on the deposit and the guarantor loans, half were waived after they took up, a random half. Okay, so when you look up take-up rates, so this is a loan offer. Remember, we didn't give anything to anyone except we offered them a loan that had a particular contract structure. If you look at the cash collateralized loan, this is kind of the standard loan that the dairy uses. It's a 2.4% take-up rate. Okay, when you give it to a random set of farmers, it's about 2.4% take-up. Okay, this is pretty common amongst microfinance joint liability type contracts. This looks a lot like a joint liability contract. It might be a bit stronger. But even if you think of the microfinance experiments, largely take-up rates are between 0 and 10%. Okay, there's a lot of loans.
This is similar to the standard loan contract in most developing countries.
Yeah, this is a very standard guarantee contract in some way. They often have you, you know, they might not be explicit about saying you have to have money, but they usually ask you to guarantee it.
So we wouldn't see 2.4% as extremely low, or just
I think it, you know, it depends on. So it depends on what the other 98. Can I count? Can I do 100 minus 2? It turns out not so quickly. You know, it depends on what the other 98% are. If I think that they're all going to default, then 2% is not low. Yeah. So that was the point of this, was to say, okay, well, maybe 2% might be the right number if everybody else is a really bad risk. Okay, so if I look at the 25% deposit rate, this goes from 2 to about close to 30%. If I look at the one where you have to get one guarantor, that's about 24%. And then if I look at the pure asset collateralized loan, it's 44%. Okay, so you see this dramatic take-up. So clearly people feel like there is a credit constraint, right? If you offer them credit, more people are more likely to take it. Now the problem is we worry about exactly what Luke and I just talked about, is that the people who took up might actually be worse risks. And so you might get an accompanying amount of default. Okay, so let's talk about default before I show you more on payments. It turns out that we basically only, out of all these loans, there's about 500 total taken up loans. We grew a second phase, and that has another 500. So, you know, amongst the 1,000 loans we eventually handed out in this project, we got one default. And that was kind of our own fault in some grand sense. I'll tell you how it happened. So it was a polygamous household where the guy had 2 wives, and he asked us to deliver the tank to one wife. But the wife that was signed up to pay for it out of the dairy was the other wife. So it turns out the wife that was paying for it didn't have it and figured this out, and was reasonably unhappy, shall we say, about this process. So we had to, basically, she stopped allowing payments or making payments to the loan because she realized she was paying for something for the other wife, not for her. And then we went to the other wife and said, okay, you have to make payments. And she goes, no, no, this was a gift from my husband. I'm not paying for it. And he said, oh, I'm not paying for it either. And so basically it went into default, and we repossessed the asset and sold it to pay off that loan. So moral of the story, make sure you know who you're delivering what to and who's paying for what. But that's pretty much the only default we've gotten, so one default amongst these. So it isn't the case that we created a whole bunch of extra take-up and got more default in return. Okay, so that was one of our worries, was that we were handing out all these loans and we were worried people would default. So it seems like there are abiding credit constraints, right? That people want to borrow, they can take up, they borrow, and they can repay. Okay, so the returns have to be high enough for them that this is a doable thing. Okay, let me show you some of the other outcomes on the loans. So here I'm going to show you, let me just describe what the bottom is. A means it's the asset collateralized loan. C is the cash collateralized loan. D will be a deposit loan. G will be a guarantor loan, okay? And the M and the W mean they were maintained or they were withdrawn. Okay, so in the withdrawal group for the depositor, we actually went and gave people their deposit back. We said, oh, here's back the 21%. You've been released of the deposit. For the guarantor, we went and told the guarantor that he was no longer liable, or his savings would no longer be reclaimed. Okay, So the blue bar here is whether that farmer in that group was ever late. The red bar is whether they received a letter. So basically, if you stop paying, once you were a total of one payment behind, you got a letter saying, oh, you're late, you need to repay, you've missed a payment. And then the green was basically after you have 2 months not paid, they kind of follow you up, and about 2 weeks later, they're like, okay, we're going to take your deposit and put it towards your missing payment, however much you're behind. Okay, so this shows you how much people were late, how much people received a letter, and how often the deposit was reclaimed. Okay, so what you'll see is that largely the loans that were asset collateralized are more likely to be late. When we looked at how much more likely, it's like 100 shillings difference on average. Okay, so this is 1/10 of one payment. Okay, so they are later more often, but it's these small amounts, right? Remember that the dairy is taking their sales and deducting it from the sales. Okay, and so it's just they miss something and they miss a little bit. You can see the cash collateralized loans are much less likely to be late ever. And then the others look sort of in the middle. They kind of, as likely to be late, you'll see these are largely not significantly different. The maintained deposit one is a little lower, and the withdraw deposit one and the guarantor withdraw are largely different from the others. Okay, those are the only two that are different. The reason the deposit withdrawal is actually low, and especially the deposit withdrawal, when we hand people back their deposit, a lot of those people just put it into the principal of the loan. They just say, you know what, I thought that was at the loan anyways, can you just reduce my principal by that amount? Okay, that's what makes them less late. If you look at whether they received a letter, all of the groups are about the same as to whether they received a letter, except for the guarantor that's maintained. So where I know, this is my Mark story, when Mark knows that he's still guaranteeing me, there seems to be some effect on whether I got a letter, so whether I'm late. The deposit seems about the same throughout, there's no differences. Okay. So there doesn't seem to be a huge difference across these groups. In addition, it's not like, even if there is a difference, it's a huge amount of money. It's very small sums of money on the table here that are different. If I look at early and late repayments, this is just a fraction of loans that were paid off early. So you can see that in general, a lot of people are repaying off early. In the cash collateralized group, 80% of people pay off early. And remember, this is the guys who, you know, I've got Mark holding a third of my loan in the savings account, and I've got Luke holding the other third, and a third of mine is. Right, and the reason is most people pay it off early is because a third of the savings are in the SACO, and so a lot of people just go in and they use that, okay, to pay off the last third. So they end up coming in under the 24-month schedule. Okay, and then you'll see the deposit withdrawal and the guarantee withdrawal. Those guys are also paying off early. On the deposit withdrawal, this is largely because they get their deposit back, and a lot of them put that money into the loan. Okay, so a lot of people say, oh, instead of giving me my deposit back, why don't you pay down the principal? You'll see on the asset collateralized loan, they're less likely to repay early. You know, on repaying late, largely they're all about the same except for the depositor maintained. Okay, those guys are the least likely to repay late. If you look at the number of months it took them to repay, again, you'll see it's largely below 24. Okay, so most people are paying off in less than the 24 months. Okay, now some of this is a construct of these deposits, right? Even in the asset collateralized loan, they had a 1,000 shilling deposit. And so what happens for the last payment, you can see they're largely at 23 months instead of 24. And that's because they take the last payment and say, instead of taking the last payment, can you just use my deposit for the last payment? Okay, so a lot of people do this. They'll tend to pay the deposit into the last couple of payments on the loan. Okay. Okay, so overall, you don't see very big differences in the loan repayments across these groups, right? This is great because it does mean that there's lots of binding credit constraints and lots of good investments out there that are not being made, because the collateral or the implicit collateral requirements of these things are very, very high, okay? The downside is that we can't tell apart what Luke and Mark are doing for me, okay? We can't tell whether they're providing monitoring or they're identifying good people because we don't have enough movement and defaults to be able to do that. Okay, so that's the downside. Okay, that's on loans. So let me quickly go through some of the impacts of the actual tank itself, since we can do that in the RCT. So here you'll see, I'll show everything at baseline, control, treatment, and end line. So you can see this is a measure of the blue bars, whether they own a tank at all, and the red bar is total tank capacity, and this is in logs divided by 10 just so that they could fit. So you basically see this big increase in tank ownership by about 20 percentage points, and this is kind of a, from what I remember, something like a 20 or 30% increase in storage capacity for the household. So it's quite big. If you look at production, again, we can look at milk production and the production by cow. It tends to go up. It is an increase, and it is positive. It's largely not statistically significant. If I look at sales, you'll see the same thing. So the blue bar is milk sales, the red bar is if we trim to the right tail a little of sales, and the green is sales per cow. These are largely significant. Okay, so you're going to see increases in sales of milk. And then we looked at time use. So this is how much time boys and girls spend going to fetch water and going to look after livestock. And we split it by the people who have piped water and the people who don't have piped water. So think of the piped water guys as the blue and red bars, and the green and yellow bars being the people who don't have piped water. And the reason is some of what the tank does for the people who have piped water is what they do is they just fill up the tank on the days the piped water arrives. So they're less likely to be collecting water anyways because they have this source of piped water. They just try to fill up every vessel they have around with it. So you'll see improvements in time use. There's less time spent collecting water. There's less time spent on livestock. And this is true, even more true in the non-piped sample. Okay, so you see these big effects on time use, and they're largely there for girls and the livestock for boys as well. Okay, so you're going to see these big releases of time for the boys, for the girls on domestic water, and for the boys also on livestock. And then on schooling, this looks really bad. I should have done a better job of cutting it, but basically you'll see that there's an increase in girls' schooling in the diff and deaf, basically. In our end line, schooling attendance was lower, and that's probably because of something aggregate happening in the area. Probably rainfall was worse, and so you needed to collect more water or take your cows out more or further. And so you'll see this big aggregate drop in schooling by about 4 or 5 percentage points in the end line, and it turns out that that's less likely to happen in treatment households and much less likely to happen in girls for treatment households. So the treatment households are less likely to be fetching water because of the tank, and so the girls are back at school. The way to think of that is, you know, it's only a 3 percentage point increase in school enrollment for girls, but it's basically, you know, at times of water stress, you kind of reach the last mile, because enrollments here you can see are already 93, 94%. Okay, I'm going to wrap up and then happy to take some questions. You know, in this scenario, it looks like many people who want to borrow are prevented from doing so by these deposit and guarantor requirements. Joint liability is good, but it doesn't seem to expand access that much, or not as much as we would think. And it turns out if you use these deposit requirements, a lot of the loans will be paid off early just by the figment of the deposit. You know, weakening screening would definitely increase the demand of credit, and, you know, asset collateralization has really high repayment here. So one thing we've been thinking about is how much more broadly it could be used. You know, you have to be careful of the asset because you want something that I can't hide, right? I don't want a small asset because then I'll just tell Luke, hey, Luke, hide this at your house, and then when they come to repossess, it's not there. So you kind of have to be careful on the asset not being movable. That's the beauty of these water tanks, is they're extremely big, and you can kind of spot them miles away because you can see them standing out like little sore thumbs across the horizon. And so they're very hard to move, very expensive to move, and so they make great collateral because as a credit organization, you have a big truck, but nobody else does. And so it makes it just a really good asset for this loan. Okay, I'll stop there and I'll take some questions.